The jungle never slept. It whispered, in the wind through bamboo, in the slow drip of rain from leaves the size of helmets, in the soft shuffle of something alive but unseen. To most, this was paradise. To them, it was the front line. For nearly 30 years after the guns of World War II fell silent, an island deep in the Pacific kept its own war alive. It wasn't marked on most maps, and even locals spoke of it with unease. A place where the trees grew too thick and the sea never stopped roaring. But somewhere in that green maze, men still stood watch. Men who refused to believe the war was over. They were soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, forgotten by history, abandoned by their command, and bound by one final order: you will never surrender. To them, surrender wasn't just defeat, it was betrayal. The emperor's voice might have echoed across Japan, announcing the end of the conflict, but on this island, no such message ever reached them. Their radios had long since rusted. Their food was scavenged from the jungle or stolen from frightened villagers. Their world had shrunk to a few square miles of mud, fear, and loyalty. The years blurred together. Seasons changed, empires collapsed, and still they patrolled, cleaned their rifles, and hid from planes that no longer hunted them. To outsiders, it's unthinkable. The idea that anyone could keep fighting a war that ended decades ago. But for these men, duty was eternal. The war didn't end because no one had told them it ended. And so, they lived. Ghosts of an empire that refused to die. When travelers or fishermen neared the island, they were met with warning shots, bursts of fire from rifles older than most of their children. Stories spread through nearby villages, of uniformed figures glimpsed in the mist, of strange camps hidden beneath the trees, of men who spoke in whispers and vanished with the rain. Most dismissed them as legends, but in 1972, a young man walking through the Philippine jungle stumbled upon something impossible: a soldier in full uniform emerging from the shadows. His clothes were torn, his rifle still oiled, and his eyes were still at war. He asked one question: "Has the Emperor sent you?" The world had moved on, but for him, and for a handful of men like him, 1945 had never ended. It had just gone quiet. Before the jungle swallowed them whole, they stood in formation one last time. The sun was setting over the bay, engines rumbling in the distance, and their commander spoke words that would echo for decades. "You will fight until the Imperial Army returns. You will never surrender. You will die by your post if you must." That was 1945. For most of the world, it was the beginning of peace. For these men, it was the beginning of a promise. When Japan surrendered, the radio waves carried Emperor Hirohito's voice across the Pacific. But deep within the trees of Lubang Island, static devoured his words. The soldiers never heard surrender, only silence. And silence for a soldier is not peace. It's an order waiting to be fulfilled. Hiroo Onoda, a young intelligence officer, took those words as his gospel. He and his small unit hid their rations, camouflaged their rifles, and melted into the jungle. They built shelters out of palm leaves, cleaned their weapons every morning, and carried out patrols, convinced that the Americans could attack at any time. Years passed. Villagers tried to tell them the war was over, shouting through megaphones, dropping leaflets, even sending photographs of their families. But to Onoda, it was all a trick. He believed it was propaganda, psychological warfare to make them surrender. So they shot back. They raided farms, burned rice fields, and vanished into the mist before dawn. Every sound in the night, a bird call, a distant cough, could be the enemy. One by one, his comrades were killed or captured. But Onoda stayed. Each death was another reason to hold on. He believed that the emperor would never abandon his soldiers. And so he waited. 20 years passed, then 30. The world around him shifted. Japan rebuilt itself. Men walked on the moon, and television filled living rooms with color. But in the jungle, the order still echoed. Do not surrender. To him, loyalty was not blind faith. It was the only truth left. Because when you take away a soldier's purpose, you take away his soul. The war Onoda fought no longer existed, but it lived on inside him. Each sunrise began the same way, checking the rifle, counting bullets, scanning the tree line for movement. He moved through the jungle like a shadow, guided by instinct and memory. To him, every sound, a crack of a branch, a glint of metal, was proof the enemy was still near. He had stopped being a soldier. He had become something else, a ghost, haunting a war the world had forgotten. The jungle itself became his barracks. Vines were his walls, rivers his sentries, and silence his only companion. He mended his uniform until it was nothing but patches. He boiled bananas to make salt, dried coconut fibers for gun oil, and used rusted tins to catch rainwater. But what kept him alive wasn't survival instinct, it was duty. The one command that had never been countermanded: hold your position. He refused to believe Japan could lose. Propaganda leaflets dropped from planes. The war is over. Japan has surrendered. Only proved to him how desperate the enemy had become. He analyzed the print quality, the grammar, the phrasing. These are fakes, he told himself. The Americans are clever, but not clever enough. When villagers crossed his path, he fired warning shots. When patrols entered the jungle, he melted into the undergrowth. To them, he was a phantom. To him, they were the occupiers. As years turned into decades, the world outside transformed. The empire he fought for no longer existed. Japan became an ally of the very nation he had sworn to resist. Men flew across oceans in hours. Color television beamed news from the moon. But in that forest, it was still 1945. Then one day, in 1974, a young Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki stepped into the jungle, determined to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. Most people thought he was crazy, but against all odds, he found him. After 29 years of silence, Onoda stood face to face with another Japanese man, the first to speak to him as an equal, not an enemy, since the war began. Suzuki smiled and said, "Lieutenant, the war ended a long time ago. Japan is at peace." Onoda didn't lower his weapon. He simply replied, "If the emperor himself orders me to stand down, then I will believe it." It wasn't defiance. It was faith, unbroken, unquestioning, and absolute. On March 9, 1974, under the relentless flash of cameras and the curious gaze of the world, a man in a faded, torn uniform stepped into the light. For 30 years, Hiroo Onoda had lived in the jungle of Lubang Island, a soldier, without a war, but still a soldier. Now his boots echoed softly on the marble floor of the presidential palace in Manila. The cameras clicked. The air felt heavy, as if history itself was holding its breath. Before him stood President Ferdinand Marcos, wearing a crisp white barong, the symbol of peacetime authority. Onoda bowed deeply, both hands extended, offering the weapon that had defined his life. Wrapped carefully in white cloth was his sword, spotless, sharp, oiled, as if prepared for inspection that morning. He had carried it through storms, through hunger, through 30 years of disbelief. And now he gave it away, not in defeat, but in obedience. He was not surrendering to the enemy. He was surrendering to the emperor's word. A few days earlier, the jungle had delivered him a ghost. His former commanding officer, Major Taniguchi, once young and proud, now gray and frail, had arrived by plane from Japan. Onoda stood before him, straight-backed, eyes sharp. He saluted. The major returned the salute, then reached into his satchel. From it, he drew an old, creased envelope marked with imperial seals. Inside was a single piece of paper, an official order from 1945. The handwriting was shaky, the ink nearly gone, but the words still carried the full weight of the empire. The war is over. You are to cease all combat operations immediately and return to Japan. For a long moment, Onoda didn't move. He read it once, twice, and again, lips trembling as if translating every letter into 30 years of silence. His rifle, polished but aged, hung loosely by his side. And then quietly, he exhaled. "The Emperor has spoken," he whispered. "The mission is complete." He turned to the jungle one last time. The same trees that had sheltered him, hunted him, fed him, and buried his comrades. It wasn't a forest anymore. It was a tomb of time, of loyalty, of everything he'd once believed. When Onoda stepped out, the world outside the leaves blinded him. Cameras surrounded him. Children stared at him like a legend. To some, he was a fool who refused to move on. To others, he was the last samurai, the living embodiment of an ideal Japan had long since outgrown. He walked into the palace with his head high, the weight of 3 lost decades pressing invisibly on his shoulders. As Marcos accepted his sword, he said something remarkable. That Onoda was not a criminal, but a man of extraordinary faith, and thus granted him a full pardon for the raids, shootings, and deaths that had occurred during his decades in hiding. The room fell silent. Even the reporters, for once, put down their cameras. When Onoda spoke, his voice was low but steady. "I was ordered to fight, and I fought. I was ordered to stop, and I stopped." That was all. 30 years of war reduced to one sentence. He didn't smile when the crowd applauded. He didn't cry when journalists called him a hero. He simply adjusted his uniform, bowed again, and asked when he could return home. When the plane lifted off from Manila a few days later, Onoda pressed his forehead against the glass. Below, the jungle stretched out like an ocean of green, hiding the bones of the men who had stayed with him, who had believed as he did that duty was stronger than death. For the first time since he was 22, he let the world move beneath him. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was something rarer, a man who had outlived his war. When the plane door opened, a wave of noise hit him. Cheers, cameras, the sound of thousands of people calling his name. For a moment, Hiroo Onoda stood frozen at the top of the steps, blinking into the sunlight. It had been 30 years since he'd last seen Japan. The skyline was taller. The air smelled of fuel and salt instead of gunpowder and rot. Then, slowly, he raised his hand. A hesitant wave that became the photograph seen around the world. The jungle soldier returning home at last. Below him, banners fluttered with the red sun of Japan. Crowds shouted, "Welcome home, Onoda-san." Children wore paper headbands with his name written in bold ink. To the people, he was a national symbol, a man who had carried loyalty longer than anyone alive. But as he stepped onto the tarmac, a strange silence filled him. Everything was different. The uniforms were gone. The emperor's portrait no longer hung over every street. The country he had fought to protect had become something else entirely: modern, electric, peaceful. Reporters surrounded him, their microphones like bayonets of curiosity. "Lieutenant Onoda, do you regret anything?" He paused. "No," he said softly. "I was a soldier. I followed my orders." He looked around, at men with long hair, women in Western clothes, neon advertisements for things he didn't recognize. He had expected victory. Instead, he found a world that had won without him. The government offered him money, medals, interviews. He accepted none of it. He visited Yasukuni Shrine, bowed deeply before the names of the fallen, and left in silence. At a press conference, someone asked if he hated the jungle. He smiled faintly. "The jungle never lied to me," he said. "People did." For weeks, Tokyo was obsessed with him. He appeared on magazine covers, was invited to talk shows, showered with letters. Some praising his loyalty, others condemning his blindness. He read them all carefully, the same way he used to read enemy propaganda leaflets. And then, just as quietly as he had returned, he disappeared again. He moved to Brazil, seeking a place where he could live without being watched, without being turned into a story. He farmed, taught survival, and wrote his memoirs, No Surrender, My 30-Year War. He lived like he always had, disciplined, precise, and loyal only to his own code. When he finally returned to Japan decades later, it was as an old man. He walked through the streets of Tokyo and said he felt like a ghost, a man who had come home to a country that no longer remembered what he'd fought for. Still, he never apologized. He never renounced his mission. He simply said, "I was taught to obey. That's all I ever did." And maybe that's what makes his story so haunting. Not madness, not fanaticism, but the pure, unbroken thread of duty. A thread that began in 1945 and only ended when he did. In the small Philippine town of Lubang, the streets once again filled with people. Not soldiers this time, just villagers, students, and old men who remembered when the jungle whispered with gunfire. They stood in silence, watching as the cameras packed up and the soldiers left. The war, at last, was over, everywhere, for everyone. But the question lingered in the air. What had it all meant? For the people of Lubang, Hiroo Onoda's name would never fade. To some, he was the enemy who burned rice fields and shot farmers in the night. To others, he was a spirit of the past, a man who had fought long after everyone else had stopped believing in victory. Even decades later, old villagers would tell their grandchildren stories about the man in the jungle who didn't know. In Japan, Onoda became both hero and ghost. The newspapers called him the soldier who never surrendered. School children learned his name, and television stations replayed his salute over and over. That single impossible moment when 3 decades of duty collapsed into one bow. He received medals, interviews, and an audience with the emperor himself. But when asked what he thought of his fame, he only smiled and said, "People love a story. They don't love the truth." The truth was darker. For 30 years he had killed, hidden, and hunted, all in the name of an empire that no longer existed. The men he'd commanded had died one by one, their loyalty turning to ghosts that followed him through the jungle. When he slept, he still heard them whispering, "Lieutenant, the enemy approaches." And yet, even after all that, he never doubted his orders. In his memoirs, he wrote, "Every soldier fights two wars, one against the enemy and one against time. I lost the second." Onoda's return didn't just close a chapter of World War II. It marked the end of an entire era. He was proof that obedience could outlive logic, that loyalty could survive the death of nations. In a century defined by ideology, he had become its perfect reflection, a man who believed completely, even when belief itself had become meaningless. When he died in 2014, the news spread quietly. There were no parades this time, no headlines. Just a few black and white photographs, the same tired eyes, the same posture of attention. He was buried not as a legend, but as a soldier who had finally been allowed to rest. In Lubang, the jungle has grown back. Vines cover the old camps, rifles rust under the roots, and the trails he once patrolled have vanished into green silence. But somewhere out there, in the shadows of those trees, history still breathes. Because Hiroo Onoda's war didn't end in 1945 or in 1974. It ended when the world finally understood what his story meant. That surrender isn't always about laying down a weapon. Sometimes it's about forgiving the world for moving on without you. As one historian wrote, Onoda was not the last man of the war. He was the first man of the peace, and he didn't know what to do with it. And so his legacy lives between two worlds, between the jungle and the city, the past and the present, duty and doubt. A ghost of an empire that vanished before he did, a reminder that faith, once unbroken, can also be a prison. The island remembers. Japan remembers. And somewhere, beneath the trees of Lubang, the echo of his footsteps still fades into the soil, marking the last heartbeat of a war that refused to die.